One of the things that I try to remember, but that I sometimes forget, is that not everyone has the same background in card games that I do. It's pretty well known that I've spent a good portion of my life playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, but also I've played Pokemon and Hearthstone and a little bit of Magic the Gathering, and in all those cases, many of the concepts transfer over and they're pretty much just ingrained in my head. Now, the bread and butter of pretty much any card game, no matter which one you're playing, is going to be tempo and card advantage. Now, I do want to say that tempo in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a little different than other card games because we don't have a mana system. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Tempo is more whoever is dictating the pace of the duel. That's kind of loosely defined in Yu-Gi-Oh! In other card games, it's a lot more prevalent just because they actually have a mana system. So there's tempo-oriented plays and there's value-oriented plays. But card advantage matters a lot in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it also matters in pretty much every other card game that you come across. Now, I've never come across a card game where tempo and card advantage don't matter. However, I understand, or I've now come to understand, that not everyone is on the same level of knowledge about tempo and card advantage, and it's very easy to just laugh at the people that don't understand these concepts. But I think if there's one thing that I've learned over the past year of really Yu-Gi-Tubing to a huge audience, is that it's not really that great to just laugh at people and say, oh, they don't understand these basic concepts. I think from a content creator standpoint, it's much better to just look at those comments, acknowledge that they exist, and then just teach people about these concepts so that in the future they understand what's going on. Now, in today's video, I'm going to talk about card advantage in particular, only because this is something that I mention in pretty much every single card analysis video, and I still get comments from people asking why card advantage matters or getting card advantage confused, and I think that it's worth addressing it just in one huge video, talking about why card advantage matters and also sort of going through certain cards where card advantage matters more than others, so we can kind of talk about why cards aren't played in the grand scheme of things. Some of these cards maybe could have been used for like a why nobody plays video, but I think if we just put them in this one video, it's a lot easier to sort of comprehend if you've never heard of card advantage. So what is card advantage? Well, card advantage is a pretty common concept, and basically what it means is you look at how many cards you have available to you at the start of your turn, or at the start of a combo, or at the start of a card, and then you look at how many cards you have available to you at the end of that combo or play or card, and then you sort of compare how many you ended with versus how many you started with. Now, it also takes into account your opponent's cards, because that matters. Taking away your opponent's cards isn't quite as good as giving yourself more cards, because really in card games you want to give yourself as many options as possible, so cards that increase your card advantage are going to be pretty beneficial. But what do I mean by this? What are some real examples? So if we take a look at a card like Dark Hole, when you play the Dark Hole card, you might be thinking it's automatically going to be a plus if it destroys something, and that might make sense, but you have to take into account that the Dark Hole card itself going to the graveyard is actually losing you a card, which means that if you use Dark Hole to destroy one of your opponent's monsters, you're not getting a +1 because you destroyed one of their cards. You're actually just getting a 0 in card advantage. You're just going even there because you're losing your Dark Hole and your opponent is losing a card, so you both make you both lose a card, you both take a 1-for-1 trade, and that's not super great. Now, in some cases, destroying that one card really makes the tempo in your favor. Maybe that one card was about to get your opponent a ton of advantage, but from a strictly card advantage standpoint, Dark Holing one monster isn't super advantageous. However, if you Dark Hole 2 cards that your opponent has, well, now you've just gotten a +1 card economy. Bump it up to 3 cards, you now have a +2 in card economy, and so on and so forth. And that can kind of explain the best time to use Dark Hole, or the best time really to use any card, is a lot of the times just going to be when you can benefit the most in terms of card advantage. Now, the actual what the cards do that you're gaining does matter, and I don't want to just completely ignore that. A lot of times when I talk about card advantage, people bring up things like, well, if I have a card like Anti-Spell on the field and my opponent draws 5 spell cards, well, their drawing 5 doesn't really matter. And while that is true and floodgates do exist and I don't want to ignore them, I think overall, in general, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, card advantage matters just so much, even considering the floodgates, because obviously if a card prevents you from playing cards, well, then maybe card advantage matters a little less until you actually manage to get rid of the card that's preventing preventing you from playing the game. But in general, it's almost never a bad thing to increase your card advantage. Now, what's a card that's sort of controversial to a lot of people that has to do with card advantage? Well, I think the one that comes up a lot is going to be Pot of Desires. And a lot of the times on the Pot of Desires videos, especially the earlier ones where I maybe was a little bit harsher on people critiquing the card than I am in the later ones, I get a lot of questions, a lot of comments, a lot of concerns about what is Pot of Desires in terms of card economy. And it's a +1. And we can look at this because when you have the Pot of Desires in hand, you have one card, and when you resolve the Pot of Desires, you go from having one card available to you to having two cards available to you. Therefore, you gain a +1 in card advantage. Now, what about those 10 cards? Well, those 10 cards matter. I mean, I'm not going to say that the 10 cards just don't matter at all, but the reason we don't factor the 10 cards into the card advantage equation is because card advantage only deals with cards on the hand and field. We can't count the cards in the deck, and there are several examples that I think that once you just hear them explained, you'll understand why saying Desires is a minus in card economy simply does not work. And the reason is you can't count cards like Foolish Burial as a -2. That'd be ridiculous. Maybe even more ridiculous is counting That Grass Looks Greener as a -20. No one calls that card a -20. I mean, a lot of people know that the cards you're sending are going to be valuable resources, but just in general, no one's going to activate Grass and be like, yeah, this is losing me 20 cards in card economy. No, they're just going to be like, this is losing me one card in card economy, which it does. Just like Foolish Burial, they're -1s, but what you're hopefully doing with those cards is then sending worthwhile, valuable cards to the graveyard that you can actually then plus in card economy. For example, if you use Foolish Burial to send Destiny Hero Malicious to the graveyard, the Foolish Burial itself is a -1, but when you use the Destiny Hero Malicious effect, you're getting a +1, so you're actually going even. And then if you manage to get rid of the Destiny Hero Malicious that you just summoned and summon a third copy, well, now that one Foolish Burial has gotten you 2 monsters on board, so overall that sort of combo, that sort of play gained you a +1 in card economy. And that's kind of where things get tricky, because card economy doesn't really deal with imaginary cards, and that's kind of why we don't factor in the 10 cards banished from Pot of Desires. And it's also why it gets kind of confusing sometimes, because you really are just, all you're doing is not talking about tempo, you're not talking about the impact of the cards, you're just looking at how many cards you started with and how many cards you ended with. Now, where does this get tricky outside of Pot of Desires? It gets tricky when you have cards like Brilliant Fusion. Now, what is Brilliant Fusion in terms of card economy? If you use Brilliant Fusion to summon Gem Knight Seraphonite, it is strictly a +1 in card economy. You started with just a Brilliant Fusion, and you ended with Brilliant Fusion and Gem Knight Seraphonite. Now, why is that tricky? Well, it's tricky because, in theory, the Brilliant Fusion on the board isn't really doing anything after it resolves. However, we still have to count it into that card economy, into that card advantage, just because it is still on the board. Now, if you send a card like Perform Age Trick Clown with a Brilliant Fusion, well, now the Brilliant Fusion is a +2 in card economy, because you started with one card and ended with 3 cards. Even if one of those 3 cards is the card you started with, we still have to factor it in. And how does this explain why some cards are better than others? Well, if we go back to the Dark Hole example, for Dark Hole to get a plus in card economy, all you have to do is destroy 2 of your opponent's monsters. Now, if you look at a card like Lightning Vortex, for that card to get a +1 in card economy, you actually have to destroy 3 of your opponent's cards, because you're discarding a card, so you're taking a -1, you're losing the Lightning Vortex itself, so you're taking another -1, so you're down 2 cards already. So if you destroy 2 of your opponent's cards, 2 of your opponent's face-up monsters, you're only going even in card economy, and that means that Lightning Vortex, for it to be as good as a Dark Hole is, you have to destroy 3 of your opponent's cards, and that doesn't always happen. Now, sometimes it will, but in those cases, a card like Dark Hole suddenly turns into a much greater plus in card economy compared to a card like Lightning Vortex, because especially if we compare it to something like Regeki, Regeki will almost always be a greater plus than Lightning Vortex, because if you're destroying 4 cards with if you're destroying 5 cards with Regeki, you're getting a +4 in card economy, or if you did the same thing with Lightning Vortex, you only get a +3 in card economy, which is, it matters. Those types of things matter in the long run, and while tempo combo and impact of the cards that you're playing matter as well. Card advantage is a great way to analyze new cards. A lot of times people ask me, well, Doug, what do you think about this deck? Or Doug, what do you think about this deck? And a lot of the times is, can you look at your deck and say, how many of these cards actually increase my card advantage? How many of these cards get me more cards? How many of these cards take away my opponent's cards without making me go minus in the process? And that matters a lot. Many of the rogue decks, many of the casual decks, that's what they lack. They sometimes lack the impact of the cards, the power level of the cards, but a lot of the times they simply just don't have cards that plus in card economy, and that matters a lot when it comes to competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Or really just any competitive game in general. You need to be gaining cards, you need to be gaining options, or at the very least, you need to be taking away more of your opponent's cards than you're losing. And just to round this video out, I do want to mention, this is why cards like the God cards don't make that much of an impact. This is why cards like Chaos Max Dragon don't make much of an impact. Yeah, how can I go a video without mentioning these two very well-known cards on my channel? Well, the God cards are all -3s in card economy because once again, you're taking the minus for tributing 3 monsters, and then putting the God card on the field doesn't count as a plus because it was already in your hand. You start with 4 cards. You start with the 1 God card in hand and 3 monsters on board, and then you end with just 1 card, so it's a -3. A card like Chaos Max Dragon or just ritual summons in general are almost always going to be minuses. Hopefully they're just a -1, like if you use Advanced Ritual Art or Chaos Form, but for a lot of other ritual decks like Gishkis, they're almost always a -2 in card economy, which makes it really rough. I think of Gishkis a lot actually because Gishki's Yilgagez is a pretty darn good card. It has a pretty powerful effect that when it resolves gets you a +2. The problem is that when you ritual summon that card, you're usually taking a -2 already, which means that for Zilgagez to be worth it, you have to resolve its effect, not only to draw the card, but also to shovel the card back into your opponent's deck. And even after you do all those things, you still haven't plussed in card economy. Now, if you run something over by battle, well, that'll be a +1, but that's a lot of work just to get a +1 or just to go even, which is kind of the main issue with ritual summoning and a lot of the old fusion summoning decks, just as a general sort of standpoint there. It's just, it's really hard when your whole mechanic revolves around minusing and the payoff isn't that big. Anyway, though, that is going to wrap up this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this discussion on card advantage. Maybe in another video I'll talk more about tempo or power level or consistency. I think card advantage is an excellent starting point just because I mention it in almost every single card analysis video, as I mentioned at the start of this discussion. I will see you guys later, though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.